A Great Argead Saga ALEXEIN, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Macaulay Naki. Episode 44, Seal of Thebes. The guest pavilion of the Macedonian court, Pella, continuous afternoon. The raw, biting humidity of the waterlogged northern earth and the stinging aroma of burning pine wood smoke refused to depart from the physical frame of General Pelopidas. Even surrounded by the meticulously curated luxury of the Macedonian court's guest pavilion, wrapped in fine, imported Tyrian silks and insulated by heavy tapestries depicting ancient legends, the 42-year-old Titan remained entirely unconditioned by his environment. His presence radiated a clean, unvarnished aura of martial discipline that stood in absolute clinical opposition to the dense perfumes, stale sweat, and stagnant odors of terror saturating the domestic palace. Stationed directly beside a monumental arched window, Pelopidas audited the stone courtyard below. His slate-gray eyes were flat, analytical, and completely empty of human warmth. Below, his legions executed zero parameters of passive rest. Despite the agonizing, grueling march from the south through flooded plains and rugged mountain passes, the Boeotian hoplites were continuously driving through their brutal combat drilling. The rhythmic, seismic thud clash of their interlocking bronze shields and the sharp clinical trajectory of their drilling commands functioned as an overt geostrategic signal, structurally re-engineering the psychological environment of Pella. Let the barbarians listen to the rhythm of a real army, Pelopidas thought, his jaw wired tight as his thick fingers lightly tapped the gold leaf hilt of his sword. His internal pulse ran in perfect, chilling synchronization with the thunderous impact of the heavy boots below. Every synchronized clash of bronze is a reminder that their lives exist purely because we allow it. Their kings die in their beds, our men live on the battlefield. The atmospheric displacement generated by each uniform thrust of those massive shields directed a silent, lethal warning toward the fragmented Macedonian factions huddling behind their shuttered windows. Calculate zero illusions that our entry constitutes a transient, lightweight cruise, his inner dialogue continued, a dark, triumphant serenity anchoring his stance. We have established our gridiron here to permanently stabilize this fractured realm, under the iron framework of the Boeotian League, or to systematically pulverize your primitive infrastructure into passive ash. The barons are maintaining their grotesque bartering sequences regarding the structural parameters of the regency, General Charon announced as he entered the pavilion, his heavy boots crunching softly on the scattered river rushes. His right palm securely clamped the margins of a tightly rolled leather intelligence ledger, the hide dark with the grease of a dozen northern checkpoints. The 40-year-old Boeotian commander spoke with the absolute flat equilibrium characteristic of an experienced administrator who viewed politics not as a theater of human passions, but as a mere matter of structural physics. To him, the fractured Macedonian court was simply a broken archway requiring an unyielding iron brace. Ptolemy of Aluros is executing a highly complex, thoroughly deceptive piece of theater, Charon continued, unrolling the stiff ledger across a cedar side table with a sharp, dry snap of parchment. He distributes hollow, zero-yield concessions to the minor royalist factions loyal to young King Perdiccas, while simultaneously rewiring the domestic grid to insulate his own absolute monopoly on power. He is buying off the border lords with promised highland timber rights, while quietly replacing the palace's inner guard with his own hand-picked, full-blooded mercenary captains. Pelopidas slowly pivoted his neck, the movement deliberate, heavy, and completely unbothered. Across his broad features ran the stark, logical lines etched deep by decades of unrelenting and hyper-focused campaigns, jagged silver-pale scars from the liberation of the Cadmea and the blood-soaked dirt of Leuctra. The fool thinks he is weaving a net, Pelopidas audited silently, his gaze drifting back to the window where the afternoon light caught the rhythmic flash of his men's spear points. He does not see that every thread he spins is merely a cord we will eventually use to hang him if he deviates from our ledger. A serpent operates exclusively by coiling its frame, Charon, Pelopidas rasped, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly timbre that carried the cold resonance of stone. A faint, dangerous smile grazed his lips, devoid of humor. Yet its final, striking trajectory remains mathematically predictable. Ptolemy starves for the Argead crown with exactly the same intensity that his marrow shivers in terror of the companion's fangs. He knows he's a dead man, walking the precise micro-negative second those Highland clans cease their infighting and unite against his house. Therefore, he demands the absolute validation of Theban legitimacy to permanently immunize his usurpation against his own people. He wants our name stamped upon his treason. The days transpirating within Pella manifested as an unrelenting, suffocating chain of dictations, cloaked as diplomatic protocols. The morning sun, struggling to pierce the perpetual shroud of northern mist, cast long, bleak shadows through the high pillars of the council chamber. The private councils called by Pelopidas contained zero metrics of symmetrical debate, zero mutual concessions, and zero room for local Macedonian pride. They were flat, imperial declarations of sovereign law delivered from the mouth of a conqueror who didn't even bother to take off his traveling cloak. In those formal chambers, Pelopidas operated with the clinical detachment of a surgeon cutting through diseased flesh, indifferent to the thrashing of the patient. He analyzed Ptolemy, watching the regent systematically mask his predatory, short-sighted ambition beneath a shifting, frantic matrix of fluid, courtly flattery, excessive bows, and hollow proclamations of brotherhood. "Look at the way he sweats beneath his gold-trimmed mantle," Pelopidas noted internally, tracking the erratic, desperate pulse fluttering at the usurper's throat with silent, absolute contempt. He smiles like a magnanimous host, but he breathes like a common thief who hears the watchman's dog growling at the door. He thinks his titles shield him. He doesn't realize that if his timber yields fall short by a single cubit, I will strip that mantle from his back and leave him to his barons. Then the general would confront the pale, dilated pupils of the child king, Perdiccas III. The 17-year-old monarch sat perched atop his preposterously massive ebony throne, his slight frame swallowed by the pre-generational robes of his father. The heavy bronze diadem on his brow seemed less a symbol of authority, and more heavy iron collar, anchoring him to an early grave. Perdiccas's unblinking, glassy gaze exposed the raw, hemorrhaging vacuum of a state in total anarchy. Every time Pelopidas laid a hand on the map table, the boy king would flinch, his slender fingers tightening around the cold armrests until his knuckles clicked in the silence. "Gods of the high peaks, do not let him see me tremble." Perdiccas prayed frantically within the quiet, terrified chambers of his own mind, his teeth clamped together so tightly his jaw ached. "He is looking through me. He knows I have no army. He knows my mother bartered Philip away because she trusts the Theban jailer more than she trusts the men guarding our own hallways." Perdiccas would look at Pelopidas not with the defiant, unyielding fire of the ancient Argead kings, but with a hollow, exhausting desperation. It was the look of a drowning child watching a colossus stand safely on the riverbank, silently calculating the structural utility of extending a hand, or simply letting the dark waters close over the boy's head to see what floats to the top. "The Illyrians have violently breached our defensive perimeter along the western frontier, General." The screaming roar of a Macedonian scout shattered the structural decorum of the council chamber later that afternoon. The man collapsed onto the marble floor, his linen corselet caked in black dried blood and the gray dust of the highway. He unrolled his intelligence report with trembling fingers, his breathing a ragged, whistling wheeze. "Bartolus' vanguard has executed a devastating raid across the environs of Euripus. They have reduced the agricultural baseline to ash, plundered the entirety of our livestock, and left the border garrisons pinned to the earth." Ptolemy threw his palms toward the cedar ceiling, exposing a carefully engineered theatrical manifestation of absolute despair that failed to register an ounce of authentic grief in his cold eyes. "Audit the metrics of this room, General Pelopidas," Ptolemy cried out, his voice pitch strained, cracking with an artificial panic as he turned toward the Theban delegation. "The very soil of Macedonia is actively bleeding out before your eyes. My administration petitions your command for an immediate lightning-fast intervention to permanently crush these northern barbarians. We have signed your covenants, now protect our fields." Pelopidas remained completely statuesque, his baseline equilibrium undisturbed by the regent's frantic histrionics. When he spoke, his voice vibrated with the cold, unvarnished supremacy of an imperial superpower. "The military apparatus of Thebes has finalized its immediate mobilization parameters," Pelopidas rumbled, his gray eyes sweeping across the assembly of Macedonian lords like an incoming storm. "But hear the structural calculation, Regent. My spears are structurally unauthorized to protect a bankrupt house that actively extracts its own viscera to accelerate its domestic collapse. My hoplites are ready to execute the march. But they will commit zero resources to bleed for a fractured throne that cannot even govern its own hallways. Out from the deep shadow of the monumental stone columns, General Attalus executed a sharp, aggressive forward stride. The 22-year-old northern predator completely bypassed Ptolemy's trembling frame, driving his unblinking, venomous gaze squarely into the face of the Theban general. His heavy baritone carried the primitive, volatile friction unique to the Highland warlords who ruled by the law of the axe. "You articulate the vocabulary of a fractured house, Pelopidas," Attalus rasped, his hand clamping down onto his sword hilt with enough force to turn his knuckles white. "Yet your own hands are actively driving the wedge deep into the structural splits of our state. Your strategy ruthlessly deadlocks the army from marching against the Illyrians until the precise micro-negative second our administration surrenders the total parameters of its sovereignty. While your intellect waits for the implementation of your idealized order, the native settlements of Macedonia are being systematically cremated. Our women are being dragged into the mountains while you audit our ledgers." Attalus leaned his muscular torso heavily across the cartographic charts spanning the council table, compressing the physical space between them until his bronze breastplate nearly brushed the Theban's armor. "You did not descend upon this gridiron to stabilize this house," Attalus hissed, his breath hot in the chill air. "You entered this palace to completely hollow out its internal mass, reducing our architecture to an impotent, dependent ruin that lacks the structural capacity to sustain the weight of its own roof without the leverage of Theban spears. You want us weak so you can play the master." Pelopidas returned the young Highlander's volatile defiance with an absolute freezing tranquility that carried the immense weight of uncontested hegemonia. "The architecture of permanent equilibrium requires an immortal, living guarantee, boy," Pelopidas responded, his voice dropping into a register that made the hanging shields rattle. "The young princes of your sovereign houses, including 14-year-old Philip, shall execute an immediate departure for Thebes. They will navigate our state not as common prisoners, but as guests of the highest ancestral lineage. Within the core of our academy, alongside Epaminondas, they will continuously audit the absolute operation of Theban martial mass. They will molt their provincial identities, returning to the soil, not as crude brawlers from the training pits, but as authentic commanders primed to flawlessly govern a unified empire under our shield." Attalus let loose a sharp, discordant bark of absolute mockery, his face flushing a dangerous crimson. "Guests of state, you classify them?" Attalus sneered, his fingers twitching violently against his scabbard. "The madman wants to take our future," his inner thoughts boiled with a cynical, pure-blooded hatred. "He wants to turn the Argead prince into a servile southern clerk. Your strategy starves for the flesh of Philip because your intellect computes that an Argead prince held as a permanent hostage is the solitary manacle that can successfully anchor our barons to your matrix for eternity. You desire to completely castrate the native essence of Macedonia from that boy's marrow, systematically rewiring his biological infrastructure to default to the servile, sycophantic obedience demanded by Boeotia. Do you calculate the purchase price of stability to be so cheap that it fails to warrant the extraction of that guarantee, General?" Pelopidas asked softly. The Theban merely executed a solitary, arrogant elevation of his brow. The lethal threat embedded immediately beneath his clinical vocabulary stagnated heavily within the room, like an atmospheric compression. Ptolemy, whose sensory metrics immediately registered the shifting alignment among the barons, men who were thoroughly exhausted by the state of total anarchy and wanted the Theban army at any cost, slowly nodded his head. He reached out and forcefully clamped his hand over Attalus's forearm, neutralizing the young general's volatile protest to signal his absolute compliance to the terms. "We accept," Ptolemy smoothed, his voice shaking slightly under the cold weight of Attalus's glare. "The prince will be ready." The transaction was flawlessly finalized. Over the subsequent days, the theater of operations shifted its coordinate, transitioning into a radically distinct formulation of warfare, the silent matrix of intelligence gathering. The covert operatives deployed by Pelopidas infiltrated every sector of the capital, surgically dissecting the true parameters of Ptolemy's administrative control and tracking the wordless, continuous vibrations of insurrection whispering through the ranks of the companions. The morning sun had barely crested the Athenian horizon, yet the queue outside Lysandra's shop already snaked around the corner of the narrow alleyway, a disjointed column of the city's walking dead. The air in her clinic was thick with the copper tang of blood and the sour, heavy scent of unwashed wool. She hadn't even finished grinding the morning supply of willow bark when the threshold of her shop became a staging ground for the city's agony. She looked at the line, her brow furrowed in a sharp, professional frown. "What is happening here today?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion as she beckoned a limping porter inside. "Has there been a collapse at the harbor? A plague outbreak in the streets?" Before the man could answer, the door swung wide. Menander stepped into the light, followed by a quiet, disciplined phalanx of figures, men and women, whose faces she recognized from the darkness of the tunnels. They were dressed in clean, simple linen, their movements synchronized and purposeful. "I thought you might need some help," Menander said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the chaotic morning. Lysandra wiped her stained hands on her apron, her eyes narrowing as she looked from the crowd outside to the volunteers now lining her walls. "You sent all these people here?" she demanded, her tone rising in disbelief. "Are you trying to bury me under the weight of this city's neglect?" Menander's expression remained serene, untouched by the frantic pulse of the room. "People need your help, Lysandra. And we need yours. If you truly wish to save this broken world, we must save lives together. We provide the labor, you provide the knowledge. We offer salvation to them by offering them a chance to draw breath for one more day." Lysandra paused, her pestle hovering over the mortar. She studied him, struck by the sudden metamorphosis. Gone were the ragged, soot-stained tunics of the tunnel. Today, Menander wore crisp, clean linen, modest, yet cut with the unmistakable precision of the nobility. His demeanor was polished, his speech devoid of the desperate, gravelly rasp of the tunnel dwellers. He stood with the effortless, charismatic poise of a man born to lead, a true priest of Isis, who understood that authority was a tool to be wielded. "We need knowledge," Menander continued, gesturing to his followers, who were already organizing the shelves and setting out fresh water. "We need skills and practice. Teach us the basics, and we will master them little by little. Tell us what you need, herbs, resins, fine linen, and our network will procure them from every guild in Piraeus." Lysandra stood on the precipice of a choice. A week ago, she was a lonely sentinel against the tide of death. Now she was being offered a small, desperate army. She wondered briefly what Menander's true endgame was. Did he seek piety or influence? But she ruthlessly cut the thought short. "Busy is better than standing still while the world rots," she told herself. She turned to him, her eyes flashing with a new, dangerous resolve. "If you are to be my hands, you will not be clumsy ones. It is a long, grueling road, and the memory of the body is a cruel master. If we are to do this, we do it with precision." She glanced at a young woman in the group who held a small wooden tablet and a reed stylus. "You," she commanded, pointing to the girl. "You are the scribe. If I say a measure, you record it. If I name a symptom, you log it. And you, Menander," she grabbed a heavy jar of dried thyme and thrust it into his hands. "You wanted to learn? Start by cleaning the supply jars. If they are not sterile, the medicine is poison. Let us begin." The scent of burnt herbs and stale water clung to the shop, a stark contrast to the sudden, unsettling stillness that radiated from Menander. He stood by the workbench, his hands, long-fingered and strangely steady, resting atop a stack of clean linen. Lysandra paused her work, her eyes fixed on him. "You speak of salvation as if it were a physical weight you could lift from their shoulders," she said, her voice quiet. "Tell me, Menander, who is this goddess you serve? Because the gods of Athens do not walk in the mud. They demand gold, or they demand silence." Menander turned, his expression serene, lacking the sharp, jagged edges of the men who usually haunted the Piraeus. "She's not of the city," he began, his voice melodic, possessing the cadence of one trained in the arts of rhetoric and sacred history. "She is Isis. The Greeks call her the goddess of 1,000 names, for she has worn the masks of Demeter and Aphrodite, and she has navigated the seas as Isis Pelagia, a beacon for every sailor who has ever felt the cold breath of the abyss." He stepped closer, his gaze drifting to the line of patients waiting outside. "She was born in the dust of the Nile, where she wept for her husband, Osiris, and fought the darkness to see him reborn. She knows the weight of loss better than any Athenian orator. She is the Mater Dolorosa, the grieving mother, who understands that when the weave of a life frays, it is the mother who must catch the threads. Lysandra wiped her hands, her curiosity momentarily eclipsing her weariness. And your cult? You are not a temple cult. You do not ask for state recognition. We are a mystery, Menander replied, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. The state recognizes only what it can tax or conquer. Our mystery is different. It is an egalitarian promise that the slave in the silver mines and the noble in his villa stand on equal footing before her. We offer a direct communion. Through purification, the fasting, the abstinence, the ritual washing, we shed the filth of the world to touch a divine truth that remains hidden from the arrogant. He gestured to the volunteers organizing the tinctures, their movements synchronized and quiet. To the city, these people are debris. They are the friction of an empire that has lost its way. But we see them differently. We are a brotherhood of the broken, bound by a secret they will never understand. We do not serve her by building marble monuments. We serve her by descending into the dark. We provide the salvation we were promised, and in the act of giving it, we find our own souls anchored to something that does not rot. You seek your own immortality in the tunnels? Lysandra asked, her voice dry with a lingering, guarded skepticism. Menander met her gaze, his presence shifting from the clinical polish of a priest to something older, more grounded. His charisma was quiet, undeniable, the kind of gravity that pulled at the loose ends of a room. I seek to prove that compassion is the only force capable of bridging the abyss, Lysandra. When the world is utterly broken, one does not wait for the gods to descend from the clouds in a chariot of fire. One becomes the hands through which they work. If the city is a corpse, we are the ones keeping the spirit from leaving it entirely. Before she could dissect that, the shop's curtain parted with a frantic metallic jingle. 3 small figures tumbled in, orphans, their faces smeared with the soot of the harbor. Their clothes little more than tatters held together by hope. They stopped short, eyes wide, before spotting Menander. Their faces lit up with a devotion that bordered on the reverent. "Brother Menander," the eldest chirped, his chest heaving from a run. "We finished clearing the vents by the east warehouse. Do you have more work for us?" "We can do anything you ask. We're quick and we're quiet." Menander's demeanor shifted instantly. The lofty priest vanished, replaced by a warmth that felt remarkably genuine. He knelt, bringing himself to their eye level, and reached into his pouch. "You've done well," he said, pressing a handful of silver coins into the boy's calloused palm. "Go to the market. Fetch fresh fruits, dried fish, and enough salt, cured meat to feed the sick in the lower vaults. And take your time, the change is yours. See that you eat something yourselves before you return." The orphan's eyes bulged at the sight of the silver. With jubilant shrieks, they scrambled out into the morning light, their bare feet slapping against the cobbles. Lysandra watched them go, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You have your own little birds for your errands, I see." Menander stood, brushing a speck of dust from his pristine linen. "They are the lucky ones. They survived the streets long enough to form their own pack. They are the eyes of the Piraeus. They see the cracks in the masonry long before the city officials do. And they hear the whispers in the dark, don't they?" Lysandra's eyes narrowed, her tone turning razor sharp. A perfect network for gathering rumors. Who is moving what? Who is meeting where? Which merchant is stockpiling grain while the poor starve? Is that your true objective, Menander? Or are these children merely your spies? Menander didn't answer. He simply tilted his head, a faint, enigmatic smile touching his lips. A look that told her nothing and everything all at once. Lysandra let out a scoff, pushing off the workbench. "You wear your nobility like a cloak you forgot to take off, Menander. The way you speak, the way you command, you are high-born, are you not? Which house? Which father's name are you running from?" This time, Menander's smile vanished, though his composure remained unshaken. He stepped into her personal space, his voice dropping to a low, intimate hum. "Is this a marriage interview, healer? Are we auditing my lineage, my inheritance, or the size of my family's estates?" He leaned back, his eyes dancing with a playful, dangerous intensity. "As I said, we have networks, groups of like-minded souls bound by the same idealism. We work for the sake of the realm, to salvage what can be saved, so that something, eventually, might thrive again. That is my only house. That is the only name that matters. He held her gaze, his expression a calm, unreadable facade that offered no purchase for her skepticism. The air in the shop seemed to thicken, charged with the weight of the secrets he clearly held behind that composed, aristocratic mask. He didn't blink. He simply maintained that enigmatic, steady stare until the silence grew heavy enough to vibrate against the stone walls. Now, he said, the sudden ease in his voice jarring as he turned his back to her to inspect a crate of medicinal herbs. The transition was so fluid, so effortlessly dismissive of her probing, that it felt like a tactical withdrawal. Should we attend to the line forming outside, or would you prefer to keep interrogating your new partner? Lysander didn't move. She ignored his attempt to steer the conversation, her mind already racing past the mystery of his identity to the grim reality of their project. She stepped into her space, forcing him to acknowledge the pragmatic rot she had witnessed in the tunnels. "Do not mistake my interrogation for mere curiosity, Menander," she snapped, her voice cutting through the shop like a sterile blade. "You talk of salvation, of salvaging the realm, but you are operating on idealism alone, and idealism is not medicine. Look at the people you have brought me. They aren't just sick, they are hollowed out. Their bones are brittle, their blood is thin, and their immune systems have been surrendered to the mud." She gestured toward the door, where the queue of gaunt, trembling figures stretched into the shadows. "You have to find competent cooks, people who understand the chemistry of sustenance and secure consistent food resources. They need calories, proteins, and nutrient-dense broth to survive the tinctures I am providing. Without sufficient nutrition, the salvation you are offering them is nothing more than a temporary postponement of the inevitable. You cannot build a sanctuary on an empty stomach, and you certainly cannot heal the dying if you are merely fueling their slow, systematic starvation." Menander didn't flinch. Instead, he met her sharp gaze with a calm, reassuring nod that suggested he was already 3 steps ahead. "Surely," he replied, a shadow of a confident smile crossing his features. "That is already on our plan. To be continued in episode 45, Lion and the Disciple. A Great Argead Saga ALEXEIN. Volume 1, Telesias, the War Dance. A new episode every single day. We are dropping a new episode every day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias playlist. Subscribe to follow the rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.